Hello and welcome to CubsPS Plus, a Northside numbers game, a weekly podcast that dives headfirst into the analysis of hot topics driving Chicago Cubs baseball. I'm your host, Mike Waller, a lifelong Cub fan, full-time baseball stat nerd, and sometime youth baseball coach. Thank you for being here today. I know you have a lot of choices. You can also find me on Twitter, Instagram, TikTok, YouTube, and now Threads, all at CubsPS Plus, a spin on the baseball metric OPS Plus. If you can, please take 10 seconds and drop a rating or a review wherever it is you get your podcasts. If you've done that, thank you so much. Maybe you could share an episode with a friend. Just a few seconds on your end can help me get better and help other Cub fans find the show. You can now support the CubsPS Plus podcast by going to my page, cubspsplus.patreon.com. There are 4 support tiers that come with added perks, such as access to a private discussion group, access to bonus episodes, the ability to submit questions to interview guests, and more. Your support will help me keep this podcast ad-free. Welcome into episode 45, the Billy Jurges episode of this podcast. This is the second time he's been a part of these episodes. In episode 11, titled October 6th, The Ghosts and Goats of Baseball Past, I talked about Billy Jurges missing the 1932 season and the subsequent World Series against the Yankees after being shot by a Chicago showgirl, which may have played into both Babe Ruth's famed called shot and been part of the inspiration for Roy Hobbs in the book The Natural. It was one of my favorite episodes to do, so if you haven't checked it out, I recommend it. Since I last recorded, we got to see a series win in the Bronx, a thrilling home run derby, Justin Steele pitched well in the All-Star game, and the Cubs opened the second half in very meh fashion. This weekend against the Cardinals will go a long way towards determining whether the Cubs are buyers or sellers. For today, though, I have a very special guest. Greg Zumach from Northside Bound and the Cubs on Deck podcast joined me. He and I had a really enjoyable conversation about all things MLB Draft. We talk about the Cubs draft picks, overall draft strategy, and how he approaches getting to know so many players and breaking it all down for his audience. It's a look behind the curtain today, and one I think this audience is going to enjoy. Are you ready? I'm ready. Here we go. So this week I'm thrilled to be joined by Greg Zumach of Northside Bound and a regular on the Cubs on Deck podcast. Welcome in, Greg.
Yeah, really appreciate it, Mike. This is, I know we've talked about this for a couple weeks. When can we come on, find a time to just chat about baseball? And this is a great time, so I'm just really looking forward to diving into it with you.
Great. Well, this is going to be good. So we're going to talk a little bit about the draft, but what I really want to talk to Greg about is get into his process. Like, I know a lot of people that follow me are kind of baseball geeks and they're into the numbers and they're into the nerd stuff. And so if somebody wanted to really start looking at the 2024 draft, how would somebody do it? What goes into putting those mocks together? So, Greg, you want to give a little bit of background first? It's the first time on my podcast.
Yeah, so I appreciate it. So, this isn't my day job. This is just, but I happen to have a little bit of time today. And so what I'm passionate about is diving into baseball in a few different ways. One of them has been the draft. And that's a admittedly pretty niche-y topic, right? Like, if you look at the pantheon of baseball interest, a lot of it's obviously focused on the major leagues. And then you get a smaller section that's probably focused on the minor leagues, the prospects. And then, honestly, even a little bit smaller section is like the MLB Draft. But it's always been an area that I've gravitated towards. And kind of like what you mentioned, I like to incorporate the numbers with some scouting aspects. Can't say I'm always perfect on it, but that's the fun of it. And that's really what I get so excited about with the draft is because in many ways it's a bit of a challenge, right? Like you put your stuff out there this year and then you see years down the line, was I right? Was I a little off? Where was I right? I reach out to people in the game and say, hey, like this is my thoughts, and I get some good feedback. So I like to incorporate all those things, and I really just like to chat about baseball with folks online. I'm privileged to be able to do that kind of just in my off time, and I've really enjoyed the conversations I've had with many of you, including you, Mike.
Great. So when you look at the draft, and you mentioned it takes years to know how the Cubs did or how you did in your work. That makes it so different. Like NFL, NBA draft, you take that guy 1-1, he better be all pro or he might be rookie of the year in the NBA. Like that's going to be a major part of your team. Baseball, it's not that way. I mean, maybe Pittsburgh with Paul Skeens taking him number 1, he looks like somebody who, if he stays healthy, maybe shoots up the system quickly. But we're talking, I can remember Ben McDonald in my lifetime playing the same year he got drafted, and I'm not sure I can remember anybody else.
Not many. Mike Leake, I remember,
that's right.
didn't go to the minors. It's just because what we would consider like his floor. And so for anybody who's not super familiar with like the scouting frame, that just means, and this is good context for what we're about to talk about, but it's the lowest expectation is the floor. The ceiling is the height. The peak. Like I'm sure many people here listening to your fine podcast would know, but just for some context. And yeah, like it's a really interesting question because there's not going to be a lot of people that go straight to the majors. But like you were talking about, I think it may take years for many of them. Yeah.
And one thing I've seen pretty consistently, I know Fangraphs has done a couple studies on it. When you look at the number of players who are drafted, now this is across baseball, not any specific team, a little less than 20% of guys drafted ever make it to the major leagues. Now, obviously, if you're a good org, you can be a little above that. If you don't have a good player development system or good scouting, you can be below that. But that tells me that on average with the Cubs, I would tend to think they have a little bit better than average scouting and development. They should probably be getting 5 to 6 players, maybe max, out of every draft, eventually making it. And that's just making it to the major leagues and making an appearance. And so when I look at the draft, like I guess high level, let's start there. Like who from this draft do you see maybe being some of those 4 to 5 guys or 6 guys?
So I've described this online a couple times that the first pick, just in this particular year, served as an anchor on that draft, and not in an anchor that it sunk the draft, of course, but an anchor is in it could. You're right, but. In many ways, the Cubs took a player in Matt Shaw. He was a shortstop out of Maryland. I had the pleasure of watching him in Omaha, not for the College World Series, but for the Big Ten Championship. And, while I don't think he ends up at shortstop, I think the bat showed you that he's going to be versatile. They've spoken about his versatility. He does everything you would want him to do. And despite the fact that Maryland's a really good hitting stadium, a hitting location, his home ballpark, he actually even hit just as well on the road. I hand calculated that. I'll have it for a piece, give or take a percentage point. He basically was about the same hitter at home and away, and was the Cape Cod League MVP, so that's a wood bat league. I think when you look at who are the major leaguers that the Cubs got, I think that you have to start with Matt Shaw. Mm-hmm. There's not a lot of development steps that he needs to make to not be to be a major leaguer. There's probably a little bit with his plate discipline. It's something the Cubs have talked about publicly, and very briefly they didn't really harp on it because he's pretty good at the dish. But I think he stands to make a little bit of improvement there, and then ultimately just find out defensively where you settle out. But he's fairly a quick mover. I'm going to skip over the second player that they drafted just because I think there are some more questions, but not as high of a floor, but potentially a pretty high ceiling. We'll talk about him in a second. But then they drafted a few college guys in the 3, 4, 5 range that I think you have to look at and hope that you're getting major leaguers out of them. There's no guarantee. But Florida shortstop Josh Rivera, I'm a huge fan of. Again, saw him in Omaha. That was at the College World Series. Came away extremely impressed. He's a later age breakout, but definitely somebody that I think is worth watching, and he does a lot of things that you would want. I loved him as a third round pick. Just really so happy. I don't even remember what I tweeted, but I think it was just like a lot of exclamation points and with Josh Rivera's name on it. Not very insightful, but I was very excited. So I really like that pick. Will Sanders was the right-handed pitcher that they took just immediately after that, and he came into the season with some folks really thinking he was a first-round caliber player. Very projectable, tall, looks like he can add some more strength to it. It probably fixes his fastball a little bit, optimizes it. I think he's a really, really great pick. And then Michael Carrico, who was a catcher out of Davidson, just has extremely good batted ball metrics. And so the ones in particular that I look at are contact rate, some incorporation of exit velocity. It kind of depends on what I'm looking for, whether it's a max exit velocity, 90th to 92nd percentile max exit velocity, Some people kind of go hit or miss on that one, or an average exit velocity. And I would say his exit velocity is maybe a smidge lower, but there were some reasons with injuries. But he does not chase the ball, which is another factor that I look at, and then he makes great contact. And so, he has a lot of the factors that those four, so 1, 3, 4, 5, are the ones that I would look at in particular. There are some folks inside the organization that are very high on their second round compensation pick, Jackson Wiggins. Mm-hmm. He's coming back from Tommy John surgery, but flashed some very, very elite stuff. He's probably the one that merits the biggest question marks, but he's also the one that could reach an really high ceiling. And so when you anchor the draft with these other players that you're like, we feel really good that these are major leaguers, potentially even all-stars, but we feel like we've got major leaguers out of this, we can take a chance here on the ceiling of Jackson Wiggins. He's not signed yet, so I don't have any concerns there, but that's one that I think will probably go down a little bit closer to the July 25th deadline.
Okay. And I think I've seen the Cubs have signed 17 of their 20 so far.
17 of the 20. I believe we will have some more very soon, depending on when this drops.
It looks like they've got some extra money for overslot. Mm-hmm. And I know one of the Zaire Hope, right? The guy that was going to go to UNC is probably one guy who's going to get a chunk of that overslot money.
I'd guess, yeah.
So talk through the money side of it. So I know every pick has a slot value. You have a certain amount of money you're allocated to spend, and then I think you can go over, but there are some penalties involved. Talk through the slotting and how that works.
Absolutely. So this is probably one of the biggest differences compared to something like the NHL, NBA, NFL draft, in which I know there's some variability there, but in many ways these drafts, like, you get picked at this pick, this is what you're getting paid. I'm not knowledgeable enough to know about the differences in how you hammer out a contract there, but generally that's what you're getting paid. There's not really much discussion there. In MLB, with very few exceptions, each team gets what, like you were describing, which is a slot value for a particular pick. And then for those first 10 rounds, all of those picks together, that gives you what's called the bonus pool. And you can spend that money with, again, very few exceptions, in almost any ways that you want. There are certain players that meet a particular criteria set forth in the new collective bargaining agreement that requires them to at least get 75% of that slot value. So you can't offer somebody $1 or $1,000 or something like that and just pocket millions. But outside of that range, you can. And so the Cubs they've been very creative. They're maybe slightly above average in creativity as far as the money. Some teams are really creative. That can get a little wonky, but in many ways the Cubs will move money around or take players later in like the round 6 to 10 range sometimes, in which they offer players that are usually like seniors, so they have less eligibility, and they work out deals so they offer them a lot less. Riley Martin was I believe 6th rounder in 2021 out of Quincy. He's now in AAA Iowa. It looks like a phenomenal pick, because what they did is they did give him $1,000, which is very low, and then used that money, reallocated it in many ways to sign James Torontos, would have been their big overslot that year. And so, that's how you get that money. And they're not being cheap. It's not like it is not I think players should get paid more. It's not anything that's a surprise or putting people against the wall. You work out these deals in advance, or certainly call advisors and ask and stuff like that. But you can save money, and then you can reallocate it to what I was just describing, which would be those overslots. So like usually high school players, but just guys that probably should have gotten picked a little bit higher that you might quote unquote buy down to your selection. James Torontos is a good example. Last year, the Cubs did a underslot deal with Cade Horton, which looks like a great selection. And then they turned around and offered Jackson Ferris like $3 million, which is way more than what his pick was suggested at pick 47. So it's, they like to use a little creativity. It's where you want just a lot of smart people in the room to be trying to hammer this stuff out. And, hopefully at the end you get a class that is really well balanced. And obviously, more than anything, you just want to be right about the players.
Well, when you talk about balance, so how much does the current state of both either the Cubs major league team, probably not as much, or the state of the system, are they trying to plug holes, or is it a lot of just trying to get the best talent they can find?
Well, I think it is a bit of both, which, is always like the cop out. So I'll explain what I mean by that. I don't think it's a lot at the major league level. I really don't. So getting to what you had talked about earlier, which is these guys are generally going to be taking a little bit of time in the minors. Like even your fast movers, Jordan Wicks in 2021 is in AAA. And I think he's almost ready, but, it's not like he came up and filled the left-handed, fourth starter role, in a year or something like that. And he was viewed as a relatively quick mover. So it's not as much about the major league level, kind of like what you were saying, a little bit more about the minor league system. More so identifying certain traits. And so I think what the Cubs looked at this year is they really wanted to prioritize players that hit the ball very hard. And I don't mean to make that overly simplistic. I think that's in many ways what they did. They didn't have to do that. Your top few rounds is when you're going to get the biggest bang for your buck, so to speak. And so you really do want to just go best player available, with regard to the slot bonus that you can get them signed at. But then afterwards, they were very deliberate in targeting certain players. And so you had like Johnny Long, who was a first baseman out of Long Beach. You had Brian Colmer, Carter Trice, Drew Bowser. All those guys hit the ball really hard. They barreled the ball. They got the ball onto the barrel very often. And so that's just a quality that does translate at the next level. And it's something that we saw the Cubs. They didn't take a lot of hitters in 2022, but the ones they did, like Hayden McGarry, Andy Garriola, they hit the ball really, really hard. And we're seeing the effect of Hayden McGarry up in Double-A.
He's flying
he hits
up right
the ball
now.
so hard. So kind of a fun quality to target.
What have you seen over the last? So I guess some of it plays into where you're picking too, right? So like when the Cubs were in the early days, Theo, when he was doing his rebuild, the Cubs hit on a bunch of guys because they were picking. They got Chris Bryant at 2. You can go get one of the best players in the college game. How much does the strategy change when you're drafting at the top of the order versus like the Cubs were 13th this year? Hopefully at some point soon they start making the playoffs. Maybe they're back down in the 20s or ideally win the World Series and pick 30th. I've got to think that kind of changes the overall strategy.
Oh, without a doubt. And if for nothing else, just that you have no idea what the first 12 picks are going to do. And there were players that may not have been on the board. I think that a lot of the feedback from fans watching, which was really exciting, but a lot of the feedback from fans watching was that a player that was viewed as a pretty consensus, like top 10 player, Kyle Teal, was on the board. I was going to
bring him up, so yeah.
And that was a big thing. Like, why did they pass on Teal? Well, he signed a below slot deal with the pick after Boston. I think that should tell folks a lot of like there might be something there, or just maybe teams weren't as high. So don't freak out about that. It's not like they passed up on an obvious talent, but in many ways it was you don't know who's even going to be on your board. There was some chatter that Matt Shaw was even in consideration for some of the picks, like at pick 6, at pick 10. That might have just been leverage for those teams to try to, get their guy to agree to a deal and a better deal. But I think, that there was a real possibility that he wasn't going to be there. And then when he was, it was like, well, this is just kind of a no-brainer to the Cubs brass. But your strategy has to change. Last year's draft, 2022, was talking about, there was like, some people in the industry phrased it as like, a really good top 6 when the Cubs were picking 7th. Right. So I think that a lot of folks were kind of getting upset about that, and they ended up with one of the players that if you were to do a redraft this early, probably goes in the top like 3 or 4.
Probably so,
in Cade Horton. And so, you have to just kind of have your convictions on who you're taking, right or wrong. It's worked out for some. Jordan Wicks looks like a solid pick. Cade Horton, obviously we don't know about Matt Shaw, but no concerns here. And then unfortunately, due to injuries, some very freak injuries, a really challenging 2020 draft. Ed Howard hasn't progressed like you would hope so. And so, you're going to have some wins and some losses. Hopefully he comes back and succeeds, but that's just kind of the nature of it. You don't know who's going to pick in front of you. And then sometimes you have a deal worked out with somebody like Horton. Otherwise you might just take a guy that, hey, this guy shouldn't even be on the board. Let's just pop him.
Yeah. So when you watch this year after year, do you see that certain teams have looked for certain profiles of guys? And does that tend to hold pretty typical, especially for the teams that, Tampa Bay does a great job. The Dodgers do a great job. The Astros do a great job. They kind of have their profiles of what they draft for. Would you say their drafts look fairly similar year over year?
Certain qualities about them do. Yeah, they do. I'm trying to think about just a couple like really good examples, I would say. Let me pull one up here because okay. So this is probably a fairly decent one here, but the Rays took Braden Taylor, and Braden Taylor is a third baseman out of TCU. He's known for a couple qualities. One, he makes pretty good contact. Two, he's maybe not a sure bet that he's going to end up at third base long term, but like third base, second base, he's pretty solid, very technically sound, not a standout defensive player. And then third is he does not chase the ball. And if you were to look at players that the Rays generally target, it's that. They don't put as much emphasis on the defense, especially at the corners. Like they've got Yandy Diaz, who is technically sound, I guess, if you're feeling confident on that, but not flashy at third base, but makes just wonderful batted ball profile. Well, Braden Taylor is a very, very typical player for that. And so I would say that matches up really well. Houston tends to take a lot of the same players every year. High school versus college, that's not as big of an issue, but you start to see these players that just make really big impact on the ball. Again, barrel control and stuff like that. Well, they took Bryce Matthews, who he's one of the better examples within that range of somebody that does that. And so not everybody does, but I would say that there are some trends. And so more than anything, not like this team won't take this profile, but you start to see teams identify like these are the profiles of players that we feel most comfortable with. And then you just, you get enough data points and you kind of think like, all right, I think they like this type of player, or they feel more confident they can develop that type of player. And so, yeah, there are some examples there that kind of help when you're, making mocks or asking around or talking to scouts like, hey, he looks like your kind of guy. Does that jive? And then sometimes they'll be like, yes. And then other times they'll tell you no, or even more fun, they won't respond then, even though they normally do, which usually means like, oh yeah, I think that is their guy. So, that's just kind of the fun of looking at things before and then after.
Cool. Excuse me. Got a little cough myself. So when you're looking at the Cubs profile, it seems to me, looking at the last couple of years draft, Theo had his, I'm going to draft a college bat first, and we're going to get that up here. And the end result was they hit on a lot of top picks and didn't really do a ton else. When you look at what Jed's been doing the last few years, it seems like they've been upping the velocity on the pitching staff in the minors. And you've mentioned already the less chase, more contact, more hard contact. Would you say those are kind of the trends they've been going for?
Yeah, impressive metrics. And in many ways, it's, I think, personally. Now, I mean, this is the scouting department that's identifying these guys, but it does all, it's like one team pulling the load. Shared team is what I mean. So you've got the scouting department, you've got your player development, you've got obviously your upper brass who oversee everything, and you've got your research and development, and you got your performance science. And I might be missing one, but like those are kind of your big buckets of groups of people, and you want them to all align. Not saying everything's going to be perfect, but I would say that the feedback, this has been written, this is not anything that I'm breaking news on or whatever, but the feedback that in some of those early Theo years was those groups weren't all on the same page. They definitely didn't have performance science. The research and development was fine. It was probably solid for a team of that era. The pitching development wasn't there. You had some breakouts to the major league level, but you didn't really have like pitching development. It's just a different era of baseball.
Yeah.
But those groups weren't all pulling the same way, and I think that left a lot of undeveloped talent. And so, yes, you got like the Chris Bryant, Ian Happ, Kyle Schwarber, they just nailed those picks. But then, the drafts at that time were 40 rounds, and you really only got like maybe a player or two out of them, well short of your like 5 players out of a class kind of a thing, 20%. And so that is here now. The gist that I've gotten is those groups like to work a lot better together, and not saying everything's going to be perfect, but that there's a concerted effort to take guys that our player development staff feels really good that they can develop these things. Cade Horton's a really good example. He had really impressive not batted ball numbers, but pitching metrics. If you dropped his pitching data into what we would call like a Stuff Plus calculator, that can give you a numerical number. It's redundant, but a numerical figure on like approximately how good the stuff is. It doesn't take everything into a play, but it gives you an idea. And his stuff was really good for his fastball and his slider, but he didn't have much else. And so what the Cubs did is they took those building blocks and they added, I think, a really good curveball and a very impressive like split change. I think the split change is a huge thing in his development. Simply put, I'm not confident that A, they would have taken a Cade Horton in like a 2017, and B, that they would have been able to develop him in that way.
Yeah.
Now they could take those chances, and I think they're just leaning into the opportunity to find fun development paths and try to reach them.
Well, it seems like it would be kind of an obvious strategy, because once you bring these guys on board, you want them to move through the system. I mean, you're not going to get 20 major leaguers out of a 20-round draft. There's going to be injuries, guys won't develop, whatever the reasons are. But one guy I've heard you talk specifically about on your podcast on Cubs on Deck is someone like Hurston Waldrop, who kind of fell in the draft. And you were saying that a team taking him needs to have a very specific development plan for him. Like, get into that, and what do you mean by that?
Yeah, so I'm not going to... So I won't speak to too many specifics on what I think that development plan is, but I will. I just
mean conceptually, like, what does the team need?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So he has fastball that I don't think is going to play at the pro level, and there's a few different ways that you can address it. But effectively, what he has is he comes into the draft or come into pros with certain qualities, right? And some of them are physical attributes, how well he moves. So he's very athletic. How well he throws. And so then you break it into like different buckets, and he's got, basically 4 main pitches, and he's got a few of those pitches that we would consider like plus. In fact, he probably has the single best pitch in college baseball with his splitter. Nasty pitch, unbelievably disgusting pitch, like a 64% whiff rate. That's ridiculous.
That's insane.
And totally translatable to the pros. But it's going to be very difficult for him to reach his ceiling unless he specifically addresses a couple things with his fastball. And so that's what I think. There's a few different ways you could go about it. But if you're drafting Hurston Waldrop in the first round, and he went to the Braves, which I think is really interesting, and I'm very intrigued. I'm going to dive in to try to figure out what I think they're going to do with him. But if you do that, then you want to make sure that as he comes into the pros, you already have a pro development plan. So you've probably talked to him, you give him all this information, you say, hey, this is how we're going to help you get from step A to step, C, or B this year, C this year, and then hopefully like D, E, F down the line. This is what we think we envision you as a major leaguer, but we got to break this up into different things. So this is what we're going to do with your fastball. This is what we want you to do with your splitter, et cetera, et cetera. And teams will do that with pretty much everybody. Not saying that like every 20th round pick is going to have a robust development plan for every organization, but I do think the Cubs do that. In fact, they were so deliberate about it that they will do that for their undrafted free agents. And they're very successful at it. Riley Martin, bringing him back again, he's a 2021 guy, signed for $1,000. Some organizations might have just been like, hey, thank you so much. We loved using your cash. Here's your chance. Go do it. try to make these changes. But instead, there was a very deliberate plan, and he incorporated that slider, and he's a totally different pitcher. And now he's in AAA, and he could make it to the major leagues this year. So I think you come armed with a lot of prep already for these players, and obviously you want them to buy in, right? That's a huge component of it. But that way they build and they grow, and you hopefully get the best out of each individual player.
Sounds good. Let's talk about, so as you walk through the days, obviously day one is the first 2 rounds. That's where you definitely want to make an impact. You want to get guys that you see as future major leaguers. Day 2 seems to be more about getting that depth. So hopefully you have more than one person coming up to the major leagues. Let's talk about day 3. I find day 3 fascinating because there are a lot of really good high school players that are set to go to top college programs. Like Hope for the Cubs was set to go to UNC. I know UNC often keeps their guys. And then you also have a mix of just like wild, let's take a shot. This guy has one thing that is off the charts, and let's go see if we could do something with it. Like, how do you look at day 3?
I love day 3. I think day 3 is probably the most fun. Maybe day 2 is fun too, but I really do enjoy day 3 because it's many of the qualities that you talked about, which is, you know what, you're taking swings on these players. There's no guarantee. There is less of a chance that they make it to the majors. You may not even sign all these guys. Generally, in your top 10, so that's day 1 and 2, you, with very few exceptions, you're signing those players. And so day 3, though, you're not always going to. I think it's possible the Cubs actually do sign all 20 this year, which is a little rare. But it's possible that you don't, and that's totally okay. What you're doing, though, is you're taking a chance. And so usually what you see is exactly how you described, where there's a couple guys, maybe one or two, that are what we would consider overslots. So somebody that probably could have gone in the 4th, 5th, 6th round, but they make it to day 3. They're still available. You spend probably a bunch of time at the night before working out general ideas that, hey, if we took you here and we offered you this, is that possible? Talking with advisors and whatnot. And some of them, they're going to say, you know what, ask us when we get there, because we may have a better offer, or it's very fluid. But in many ways that's what you're doing the night before, and then you're trying to firm up, these. It's very much built on depth as well, though, kind of like what you were saying. So, with the Cubs, they took Zaire Hope. He's what we would guess would be an overslot. We'll have to see when it all shakes out, but probably an overslot if he does sign. And he's indicated publicly he's signing, but... And again, I think we find that out very soon, the next couple days. But he's, he would be one that we would anticipate something like an overslot if it all comes together. And then at that point, the Cubs really pivoted to a lot of college depth, some intriguing arms. Some of them are just guys that should have gone earlier. Somebody like Sam Armstrong out of Old Dominion or Grayson Moore out of Vanderbilt. Just guys that, honestly, they were, if you had taken them in the 7th, 8th round, I wouldn't have blinked. I think it would have been totally fine. Instead, they were just there and available, and the Cubs, took a chance on them. And that's just good value play right there. And others are, they're total swing for the fences because you got almost nothing to lose. That, like Daniel Brown out of Campbell, a guy that pitched very little because of inconsistencies. When he was on the mound, though, it was like crazy left-handed velocity. Yeah. Walked a bunch of people. I mean, it's to the point that there's like literally just it's just a blank canvas, and so you hope that you take a chance there. And hey, if you get a really quality professional out of it, then and who knows, that's the kind of guy that could just skyrocket up there. But day 3 is definitely the day for dreamers. Is how I've described it a few different ways, and you surround it with a lot of pitching. They landed some of my absolute favorite picks, especially Drew Bowser in the 20th round, who we now know has signed. Just an inspired pick, a guy that was totally a first-round talent in 2020. Told teams he's going to Stanford, and then, a couple years later, it showed glimpses, just didn't quite work. But the raw tools are there, and to take a day 3 pick on that, I mean, it's so much fun. I've been cautious about him because I wasn't sure he's going to sign, and he announced he's signing, and it's been confirmed with the team. So
That's great. Well, and that's one thing especially when you get to the last few picks, if you've got somebody that is that blank canvas, or they've got, I mean, in Daniel Brown's case, there aren't a lot of lefties that can throw 101 miles an hour. So let's take, if it doesn't work out, that's fine. But that's a lot of fun. So let's step away from this draft specifically a little bit. And I guess you're probably in the decompression mode now. I know you had all the ramp up and all the mock drafts. And then last week you were making all the rounds on your podcast and making other appearances. But when do you start looking at 2024?
I've already been looking at 2024. It's a disease. No, I really do enjoy it. I actually started a little bit of prep earlier in the summer. So what I do is I get like a list together. And I try to get like just this big list of names to follow. And there's a few of them that we already know are going to be bigger names for next year. So it's those guys are pretty easy.
Sure.
But what I'll do is I'll reach out to scouts, some other analyst writer friends, and just say, hey, like these are the names that I've got. Anybody I'm missing in your area, or somebody to just kind of watch out for. And this early, I mean, you're not really worried about connecting teams, and folks are totally willing to talk. In fact, many scouts will talk anyway. Area scouts love to talk. But you just kind of try to get a big list together, and then get as many looks as you can on them. Unfortunately, I'm not going to be able to get live looks on folks. That's where the best kind of scouting is you can do, or a combination of video and live looks. I'm not able to do all of that, but I've gotten some live looks on some guys that already are big focuses of mine. And then, I just start pounding away, trying to dive into any data that I have, look at, watch some video from a few different angles, different ways, do the best I can. I dive into like PG National, Perfect Game National is a big event that happened it's like immediately after the draft. There is no rest for scouts. So I was already kind of
That's right, smack in the middle of the summer travel schedule.
It is. I mean, to the point that at some point, MLB has got to reconcile where to put the draft to make it actually work out, because I think I get why they're doing it, but I think they've put a lot of people at a big disadvantage, players and otherwise, for the specific time of the draft, and other aspects of the season, drafting season, haven't been able to adapt to that yet. Mm-hmm. So, but yeah, so I watch some of those events. I reach out to friends of mine that are at those events as well, scouts or otherwise, and just ask them about people that they like. And so, yeah, you just build out this consensus board, and I'm hoping later this summer I'll probably have my top 50, top 100, not detailed reports on everybody, but just kind of gut feelings before we get into the season. And then you put that out there, and then you get feedback from that. So it's just kind of an ever-evolving process. But it's a lot of fun, and I really do enjoy it. And if anybody ever wants to do their own, it's kind of the fun of it. You're building this puzzle, building this picture that, you won't even know what it turns out until a few years down the line. But it's kind of fun to put it all together. And if anybody ever wants insight or feedback or perspectives on it, always reach out to me if you want to.
Sure. So as you look at 2024, one thing I heard about the 2023 draft was that it was particularly strong, especially in college. And I think COVID had a big impact on that. I know my son played high school ball and graduated last year, not a major league draftable talent level, but having some kids he played with during high school go to play college ball. And, one of our friends lost his senior year and then was playing D1, and then sort of lost that because all the players that were expected to be gone were still there because, everybody got the extra year. How far do you think that impact is going to last? Do you think we're almost out of it, or do you think it's another year or two?
No, I think we are almost out of it. So there's some trickle down effects that's still there. You get some folks that still get like an extra year of eligibility because of COVID, but that's kind of going away as people that are now moving out. But you still do have aspects of, folks may have gotten like a red shirt eligible year as well. So, I mean, there's some of it, but we are moving a little bit away from the COVID impacts. What you are seeing now is the impact of NIL money, transfer rules. I'm for anything that helps players get compensated fairly or as close to fairly as they can. So I really have no issue with any of those rules. I'm not I don't have enough information to know where I stand on like the nuances of them, but I think that those are having some pretty big effects on, will players go to the pros? Will they stay like an extra year, or even just go to college instead? And I think that's where we're going to start to see some more of that impact. This draft is probably the big one, since it's 3 years after the 2020 draft, where a lot of high school talent that would have normally been drafted, they went to to college. And so that's where we saw just a really, really, really deep class that you could take guys in the third, fourth, fifth round like the Cubs did. That, I mean, a couple of years ago, I would have taken each and every one of them in the second and not really given it much second thought.
Mm-hmm. Well, and that's where, I mean, that draft in particular, we saw Matt Mervis signed, and it's almost funny now, undrafted free agent, which he technically was, but he's a guy that definitely would have gone on day 2, I think, for sure. Yeah. I think he got a ton of interest as soon as the draft was over. Mm-hmm. So what's next for you? So as you head into, I know like the prep players are doing their travel ball seasons right now. The top college players are doing things like the Cape Cod League and all those summer wood bat leagues. Do you pay a lot of attention to those?
I do. I'm not, the Cape Cod League is one that I honestly just try to get some insight from folks that are there, just because I think that there's a lot of aspects with it being a wood bat league that is really, really helpful to just get insights from people who can see it, who can hear it. And then, it's just a little bit of a better way to scout it. But, I'll look at video every once in a while. The summer leagues with the prep players is where I'm kind of focusing a little bit more of my time, in my off time. And part of that is because with college too, I've been very blessed that some folks in the game have been willing to share some data just kind of off the record or just I can share a little bit, but limited to like the players the Cubs took or something like that. And with that, you can get a lot of information from that data, and at the college level, you can get some more video. With high schoolers, you may find that there's just a lack of a lot of that, and I'd like to get as much video looks as I can on them. And so that's where I'm spending a little bit more of my time. You find those guys that maybe don't show up on a list right away. And, well, picking like James Triantos as an example, this is a guy that reclassified to the 2021 draft. He was supposed to be in 2022, but he just showed out. Like, he was just really, really impressive in these showcases, and to the point that he wasn't on anybody's top 100 board to start the year, but he ended it with a $2.1 million signing bonus. And that's the kind of thing that if you're focused maybe solely on some of the bigger picture, sometimes you might miss those diamonds in the rough. And I just like to look for those because I think that's just a fun aspect of the game.
Yeah. And I assume that data, anything you can get with velocities, exit velos, get videos so you can see how they actually play, is such a big deal, because when you go to the draft and you're trying to figure out, you're doing a mock draft of 20 rounds for 30 teams, you've got JUCOs, you've got small colleges, D2, D3, small D1, you've got the elites, the SECs and the ACCs. You've got high school kids. Like, you can't just compare stats. A high school shortstop that hits 350 and a guy for Stanford that hits 350, it's not the same player.
Yeah. No, you're exactly right. In fact, so I have my own, it's pretty rudimentary, but it just kind of gives me a sense, and I'm not a slave to it, but I've got a draft model. And I think folks have probably have far more advanced draft models, but it just kind of puts stuff into context. And so when I have data, I can drop that in there. When I don't have data, I'll sometimes use production and then scale it a little bit based on like level. Again, it's very rudimentary. It's nothing fancy or pro level, but it just kind of gives me a sense for players. But it speaks to, like the data I think is a little bit more transferable. Production, which is like what you're talking about with the stats and comparing them, are just so variable that it can help. I think it can tell a part of the picture, but it leaves a lot on the table. And that's where some of the data helps to cut through a little bit of that if you trust the data. And I will say that that's a whole other ball game, because you will get stuff, you'll get numbers that you're like, that doesn't seem right. And it turns out their TrackMan wasn't calibrated. There's been instances, I won't bring up the specifics on that, but with even like very prominent players that were getting a lot of public comment about certain things that changed or whatever with their data. And it was just a bad TrackMan unit. Like, it just happens. So teams employ a lot of people to clean data, which is really kind of fascinating and not something I'm capable of doing. They have data analyst teams of data analysts with far more experience than I do. But in general, I like to have the numbers and just let it tell some part of the picture. But ultimately, also kind of go with your gut a little bit, because that's where the fun is.
Yeah. Well, it's, to your point, I'm a Iowa grad, so I've been watching Iowa play. So unfortunately I saw Shaw's 507-foot mammoth home run.
That was a big hit. Yeah,
it was a big one. But to your point about the bad data, there was one game I couldn't watch, but I was tracking on Twitter, and I saw that Brody Brecht threw 104, and eventually it comes out he didn't throw 104, but he's throwing 100 and 102. So like it's not the end of the world, but you do see some of those things flash, and all of a sudden for like weeks after, I see people referencing Brody can throw 104. Like, not really, but
not really. But I will say, that's a perfect example of something that. So when I was in Omaha watching Brecht actually at the Big Ten Championship, I was, maybe a few rows back or something like that, and they do a pretty good job of kind of showcasing a little bit of the data, so I was kind of tracking it so I could have an idea. And it was interesting because they have a very good calibrated system. In fact, I know the folks that work over there, and they just do a great job. But that's like the amount of time and energy that it takes to get those systems up and set to make sure that you don't have, didn't really talk too much of them, but I had like scouts left and right of me. And if they had something that had popped like 101, 102 or something like that, that's a place that you could trust it. And so that would have gotten people on the phones. Like, they would have been texting scouting directors like, hey, like, I know this is a 2024 guy, but like, we got to keep this in mind. And it is really interesting how data can dramatically change how people view when it could be an isolated incident. He could have just been feeling it that day.
Right.
But it also tells you that, like, hey, if you trust it, maybe that juice is in there. So it's just really interesting how, like, a couple data points can skew how people view a player, good or bad, in the course of like a development cycle.
Well, and how do you look at that when you're building your model? How do you look at that with, say, like a max exit velo?
Yeah.
Because you could run into one, have one that's off the charts, and you never get close again, or you could be Giancarlo Stanton and you've hit 15 balls a year, 120 miles an hour.
It's great. It's honestly, it's one of the best questions that you can ask, because I don't think that everybody feels the same way. There's some folks that put more of an emphasis on like max exit velocity versus average exit velocity, which tells you, hey, like this guy's consistently hitting it over 92 miles an hour. Like, that's what you want. But there's other folks that will tell you, but if I trust a max exit velocity and I believe it's a real data point, not like a bad data point, then I know that juice is in there. And I just need to do what I need to do to get him to that. And so I'll tell you what I personally view on that is that for high school players, I care a little bit more about max exit velocity. Okay. I think average exit velocity is good. It's a very important data. But for high school players, if I can see that juice is in there, then like, hey, I'm not even running a team, but like I would view that, hey, if we trust our development team to get to that juice more often. For college guys, I care a little bit more about average exit velocity, and this is where that middle ground comes in with that 90th percentile or 92nd percentile max exit velocity. What it's effectively doing is saying, we're just going to cut off the outliers. Colton Ledbetter, who was drafted this year, is a good example. He had a max exit velocity of like 116, which is right up there with a bunch of the top players. But like, that was an outlier. Folks believed that was a very real data point. It wasn't like anything that was incorrect. But like, there was that piece, and then there were like a bunch more that were much lower than that.
So like, he did it once.
He did it once, exactly. And so you're like, well, that's why I take that max exit out, and I just look at that middle ground. in many ways, what you're trying to do is you're trying to build an individual story for every player, and you're going to look at different things. Now, teams can't always do that because they are pouring over thousands of players.
Sure.
But that's where you try to get the best research and development folks, draft analysts, scouts, all of that to come together and try to paint that picture as well as they can. But it's also probably why, sometimes you just miss on a player too, good or bad.
Yeah.
But that's kind of how I view it, because exactly what you talked about. Like, he could have had one amazing day. That guy ate 2 bowls of Wheaties instead of 1 that morning and just absolutely cranked it. And then he doesn't ever get to that point. And it's just really, really hard to know if that's a real thing or not.
Yeah. Well, I imagine that goes across the board on a lot of things. So when you're evaluating a pitcher, you want to see how the fastball plays. You want to see movement. You want to see command. You want to see the off speed, the breaking stuff, like where the plus pitches are. And I guess when you're looking at guys, and kind of goes back to our ceiling versus floor discussion, you're looking for either something that's really plus, like, hey, this guy can throw 102. I think there's a good chance I can at least put him in my bullpen down the road. Or like Jordan Wicks has that plus changeup. And if you can get that elite pitch, that one elite skill, you can build around it.
Totally. And in many ways, it also depends on what do you trust your organization to do. So with Jordan Wicks, that was at a stage that they felt like, yes, okay, got the changeup. We already know that. We believe we can add a 4-seam fastball that's going to play up at the top of the zone. We believe we can add a curveball. Ultimately, it's kind of been scrapped. But we do believe we can add a sweeper slider, and he's recently added a cutter. And because of that, they felt like, all right, the blueprint is already here. We just need to build off of it. And not every team is going to feel the same way on that. And so, yeah, like that's what you're kind of looking at. You look at what is the player in front of you. So like we talked about Hurston Waldrop earlier. So what is the player in front of you? What does he do well? Where does he need to fix? And teams are going to feel different on those things. But like that's really where it comes down to like trying to put all of those pieces together. Like how is the athleticism? How is the pitch movement? How's the pitch velocity? And then are there areas that we can fix or address? Because there are very few players that are done or basically done developing. I would say Dylan Cruz doesn't have much development. Wyatt Langford doesn't have much development. Surprisingly, I would say actually Paul Skeens has like an area that I would address, specifically related to potentially adding a cutter to his profile. I think he would just soar. And I think he's totally can do that. I could be completely wrong on that and look, foolish. But like even somebody generational has some steps. And so do you feel like when you watch them as a scout that your team can then take those steps? That's kind of the fun of it.
So you probably put yourself... So let's now talk through going through the mock draft process. So you did, 3 full versions?
Yeah.
Definitely not time consuming at all.
Oh, yeah, no, totally. They knock them out in like 10 minutes. Actually, a lot of the formatting is what usually the first one takes the most time. After that, it's not too bad. But no, mock drafts are... A lot of places use them for clicks. I have no issue with people who do that. I don't like to do that. I had requests to put up a couple more mocks from just like fans and readers, and I always appreciate that, but I just didn't have any changes, and so I just didn't do it until the end there when things were kind of moving. But yeah, mocks are fun because the reason that I like mocks is not just because they're fun to do, to guess, but also because it really is the best way that I have found to get people talking about the draft, especially specific players. And so if I did something and I put out rankings, which I've done before, and I'll do for this year as well, yeah, chances are people aren't going to really be all diving into like the 60th guy that I ranked. Right. But if I have something at pick 23, I have Cleveland Guardians fans in my DM saying like, hey, tell me a little bit about, Colt Emerson or something like that. And that's where it gets really fun, because then we can just talk baseball, and even if that pick is wrong, it doesn't really matter. Especially early in the year, we don't know anything. Right. It's more about identifying trends historically, kind of like what we talked about. But it's a really good way to just get people talking about the draft, and I love talking about the draft.
So do you go back, are you going back and looking at like, how long have you been doing this, 2018?
No, 2021 is
Okay.
when I put my first ones out there, yeah.
Do you go back and, so you're still tight in it, do you want to go back and look and see not only how did I do in terms of predicting the actual picks that happened, and that's a wild crapshoot, but also then how did the players I had ranked highly or lowly, like how did that translate? Like where are they now?
Oh yeah, absolutely. So I will say it's a little bit early on some of the ones, and 2021 was like I wasn't very practiced. That one I barely talked to anybody in the game up until the very end. And then I started to get some folks who were really very nice and considerate and giving me their thoughts. So I like to look back, because I'm going to totally make a lot of incorrect ones,
Sure.
or read the tea leaves wrong, or just get fooled on a smoke screen, which happens. It happens to teams, so I don't really feel too bad about it. But I like to look back on things. So in 2021, actually, mock-wise, I think I did fairly well. A lot of it's just getting lucky at the beginning, but I had read the tea leaves, I think, right, that the Pirates, they really wanted to save some money, and Henry Davis made the most sense to me when I kind of went through the board on that, and so that's what I went 1-1 with. That was a relative surprise, but to me that made a lot of sense. Those next few times that this year was really, really tough, because the Pirates were negotiating right to the end, and if you had told me Max Clark or Wyatt Langford, and we were pretty sure it wasn't going to be Dylan Cruz, Paul Skeens was another option as well, and they ultimately popped him. But I love to look back on rankings, and if I understood certain aspects that the teams look at for players, like we talked about, and I like to look back and reflect on those. And mixed bag, but I think some teams I get a little bit of a better picture on as we go along. And so usually based on like historical trends on what they look for, been, not bad on that. I usually get right around that kind of idea, whether they take the pick or not, not feeling too bad on it. Love to look back on rankings, though. I'm a firm believer in how did I rank a guy? What was I seeing? What did I miss? Good or bad? And that's where I think everyone that is in this kind of field or industry should always be trying to do some quality improvement and refine their game, so to speak. And so, I'm so totally not a finished product. I like to put out some really good stuff, but also always trying to get better. And so when things calm down after the draft, and when there's no negotiations going on, and when, you don't want to interfere in any of that, I like to reach out to people in the game and say, hey, these were the guys that I put out there. This is the things that I thought. Was I right? Was I off? Was there something like in models that knocked guys down? I'll share this. I had a player that I was very high, and I won't share who the player was, but reached out to certain people in the game, and they were like, yeah, no, he's good, but he's not going to rank as highly as you think. And haven't gotten all the details on that, but ultimately that actually jives with where it ended up. And so it's just kind of one of those where I always trying to get better. The teams are armed with a lot more information, and so I can always learn. But yeah, it's just, you got to have some fun with it.
And then do you go back and look at your model and update your model
a little
based
bit,
on new info?
Within the confines of, like, if there's a player that it's like, oh, well, this guy's chase rate in high school showcases is too high, I may just never have that data, and so I don't want to put too much of an emphasis on it. But I also, though, don't want to just focus only on mirroring what teams do, because obviously they're better. But the fun of it is being able to say, these are my guys, and maybe I'm even right and maybe they're wrong. But a good example of that is like Drew Gilbert last year. He went to Houston late. I would have taken him in the top 10.
Wow.
He was my dark horse top 10 pick. He and Zach Neto were what I call gut feel guys. And so I would have taken him in the top 10. And now he's in AA and doing really well. And so I might look good on that. Maybe down the line, who knows. But that's the kind of thing where I don't want to change my model to just only be what teams do. But I like to, of course, stay up to date with how folks feel, certainly.
Well, another question for you is, as I watched the evolution of the game, so the 2016 Cubs, they won a World Series. They were pretty good.
Yeah.
But the game was changing underneath Theo, and I think he didn't react to it fast enough.
Yes.
Do you try to take that proactive look? And in some cases, it might be rule changes, like there were obviously a bunch this year. Going forward, I imagine part of the trick for all the front offices is to try to stay ahead of that curve. Player development really came and grew, I won't say out of nowhere, but it became suddenly super, super important to a few teams, and it showed obvious dividends. Like what do you do to try to factor in some of those kinds of things that aren't maybe as obvious and aren't stats driven?
Yeah. I totally try to. So it's one of the reasons I had Enrique Bradfield Jr. ranked a little bit higher than some folks. And it's partly because the way the game is trending, favoring athleticism and speed and defense and contact, that I think that's going to be really undervalued. I think the Orioles got a slamming pick at pick 17 that, again, that's probably somebody I'd take in the top 12, just because I think the value is there. Now, he's not somebody I'd take in the top 4 or 5, but like that's the kind of thing where my personal view is I think some teams were a little soft on that if you feel like you can retool the swing. So that is trying to anticipate what's going to happen in the game. There are certain pitches as well that if I think that a pitcher maybe has a certain profile that at the end of the day, the game's kind of moving away from that profile, I may not like that player as much. It's all educated guesses, or as educated as I can get it. I tend to favor splitters. I really like splitters or split changeups that stay off the barrel. They would be like barrel suppressors, especially if they can generate whiffs. I think the game is moving to that in the short term. Not as a splitter revolution, but that I think that there's going to be a lot more of them. There already kind of are. And so those are pitches that I tend to favor. And then trying to guess what's after that, honestly, that may be out of the scope of what I can do at this stage. But that's kind of, I'm trying to anticipate what I'm guessing the game in 2026 is going to look like. And, we'll see when we get there.
Yeah, because the big sweeping slider was the rave pitch over the last 3-4 years.
Yes.
I think the splitter's coming next. What do you do with guys like, and we use 2 Cubs examples. So on the one hand, you've got Justin Steele, who's just killing it right now, really on 2 pitches, which I think 5-6 years ago you would have said this guy's only got 2 pitches. He's going to wind up in the bullpen. And then the other one I'll throw, and you can speak to both, is someone like Kyle Hendricks. I mean, he's already kind of an exception, a bit of a, I won't say unicorn because there are other guys like him, but he has to rely so heavily on command and location and changing speeds, getting away with it without throwing 90 miles an hour. How do you look at those guys in the draft, and how do you start to split out which ones you think might succeed versus ones that just don't have the stuff?
Totally. So I also try to look, just because I focus mostly on the Cubs, but in the draft, I look in general, but I try to anticipate what type of players the Cubs have had success with in the past, and Justin Steele is a really good example of somebody that's very unique. In fact, I would say he is the unicorn.
Okay.
His fastball certainly is. Some folks will argue it's a cut fastball. Others don't. He calls it a 4-seam. At the end of the day, it operates with what we call heavy gyro spin, which is a unique type of spin where there's a lot of spin on the ball, but that spin doesn't convey to movement. And so sometimes you describe it as like bullet spin. And it's a very unique pitch that we've done some research on. We, as in my colleagues at Northside Bound, we've got some further work beyond that we're going to hopefully wrap up this summer, which evaluates those particular type of fastballs. And it turns out that they're special, and they act in a way that suppresses damage more than most pitches. And so it's not something you can just teach everybody. And so it is that like special quality that Justin Steele has, that, he's got 2 pitches, but in many ways he kind of has like 3 or 4, just with the way he throws them and the way he utilizes them. It's really hard to try to imagine that in the draft.
Right.
Better folks than I probably can. But I do try to look at, is there something about I guess I'll describe it this way. Hitters will tell you how successful a pitch is.
That's true.
If you watch their reactions to, and this is why I like to do in live looks if I can, if you watch them and they're just befuddled during these at-bats, there might be something under the radar that you're like, hey, this doesn't jump off the board with a Stuff Plus model, but it's like, the hitters are telling you it's not an easy game. Like, they're having trouble here. And that's what prompts me to try to dive a little deeper. Kyle Hendricks is a unique example, obviously, kind of similar. I think these are great examples you brought up, in the sense that everything just needs to be clicking perfectly. But when it is, he's been one of the better pitchers in the league over the last 10 years. Mm-hmm. But it is also something that you need to have the right person that can execute it, and
yes.
Kyle has.
Well, and he lives on the razor's edge. Like when he was hurt and the velo was down, there wasn't as much separation between fastball and change.
Yep.
He got lit up.
He did. You're right.
I think I had one more question. I guess I'll just throw it out there. Who are you most excited about from this draft?
For the Cubs, 2023?
Yeah, for the Cubs.
Yeah. Fun question. I think it's the 3, 4, 5 guys. I think that's how I'm going to describe them for a while. I think it's Josh Rivera. I think it's Will Sanders, his pitcher. So Josh Rivera, shortstop, Florida, which we talked about earlier. Will Sanders, pitcher at 4. And then Mike Carrico at 5, the catcher, Davidson. And it was like, those are some of my favorite players in the class. Mm-hmm. I couldn't believe they went 3, 4, 5 to the Cubs. And I loved it. And
that's awesome.
I was just so happy about it. And there are other players that might bypass him, but I think that's just a healthy form of competition. But yeah, I was just pumped when they picked him, and I'm just going to stick with those guys.
One to end, I'll go. We talked about him a little bit earlier, but I'm an Iowa Hawkeye. I'm actually from the same hometown as Brody Brecht, so way too early, but where do you see him going next year?
Yeah, I've been thinking a lot about Brody Brecht, because when he is on, he will show you that is top 5 overall type of talent. I think if he is able to maintain consistency, he is a top 10 player in the class next year. Mm-hmm. If he does not maintain consistency, then I think you see him look a little bit more like Hurston Waldrop's not even a good example, but maybe that range, which is somewhere in like the 20s to 30s, where a guy with supreme stuff falls to a team that is it's one of the better teams. And usually one of those better teams, like the Rays, the Dodgers, etc., Blue Jays, have a really good pitching development, and those players usually don't keep falling because they look at that as a unique opportunity to take a guy with frontline stuff. But I don't know. Let's just say, I'll just give you like a number.
Wherever the Cubs pick, right?
Yeah, there you go. Yeah, let's say like 14, 15. Something like that. Yeah,
because I mean, watching him, I didn't see all of his starts this year, but I saw several. I mean, I watched him. He dominated LSU.
Yeah.
He was on that day. I think he had 12 strikeouts in 5 innings, something like that. And then other days, it was just a walk fest. Just couldn't.
It was.
Or he'd be effective, but he'd run up his pitch count so high he's out in 3.5 or 4 innings.
And that was the game I saw in the Big Ten Championship against Indiana, where I thought he was going to be out after 2. I was pretty sure.
He really battled in that one.
Is what?
He really battled in that one.
He battled. And I wrote this in some kind of a write-up that was just, I think it'll be out. Oh, or maybe it was already just live looks at folks, or it'll be out in a separate piece. I think that's what it is later this summer. But I wrote this, so coming attraction, I suppose. And the pitcher that he was in innings 1 and 2 is very, very different than the pitcher he was in like 3, 4, and part of 5. And it was just really impressive how he battled. And you're not going to have it every day. Obviously, you want to mitigate those kind of days. But it was still amazing that we just kept going through the game, and I was like, oh my gosh, he's still in, and he's like being successful. Now it wasn't looking pretty. The stuff looked amazing. Location was off, but yeah, he really battled, and it was a very successful outing.
Yeah, I would agree. Well, thanks. This has been a great discussion. Greg, where can people find you?
So you can find me at Twitter, for as long as that's around, at Ivy Futures. Please reach out if you have any questions. I will say that not to like harp on Twitter, but they're having issues with like DMs that aren't always coming through, and there's like settings that keep changing. So, feel free to DM me if you ever have questions or want to talk about baseball. If I ignore you, please do just honestly reach out in like a reply, something. I assure you it's not intentional, unless you're yelling at me for some reason, and then I might ignore you. But those are few and far between. So yeah, reach out anytime or just jump on there. You can also find my work at Northside Bound, which is a place where we talk primarily about Cubs prospects and the MLB Draft as well. But just a fun place to talk baseball. And Mike, it was a real pleasure to talk with you today about this.
Yeah, I'm sure we'll talk again between prospects, or who knows, hopefully not the trade deadline so much, but I guess we'll see how the next week goes. Yeah. Well, thank you so much, Greg.
All right, appreciate it, Mike. Thank you.
Thank you for joining me today. If you like this episode, please drop a rating and a review wherever it is you get your podcasts, and share an episode with a friend. Just a few seconds from you gives me great feedback and helps other Cub fans find the show. You can find me on Twitter, Instagram, TikTok, YouTube, and Threads, all at CubsPS+. And check out the Patreon page, CubsPSPlus.patreon.com, to help support the show and keep it ad-free. This is Mike Waller, host of the CubsPS Plus podcast. Every day with Cubs baseball or talking about Cubs baseball is a great day. Go Cubs!